then to verse 29. For those he foreknew. Notice the shift to the past tense in verse 29.
Now, this is going to be very important to his argumentation. Very, very important to his argumentation. And the problem is that, and I had a conversation, actually had almost the same conversation with someone at ReformCon recently. Why are these all in the past tense? We have to be very careful. We've all, especially when you're first learning the language, you fall into this trap fairly regularly. But, for example, these are in what's called the aorist. And generally, the aorist is referring to something that happens in the past, but not always. That is, the aorist is the simplest form of expression in the Greek language. That's the simplest way to say that something happened. You have to start complicating your verbs a little bit when you move them into the present. See, for us, the present seems to be more of the basic, and we teach Greek wrong, to be honest with you, in some ways, because we start with the present, and then we move to other forms, not recognizing that in reality, the most basic roots are normally the aorist roots rather than the present tense, and you start looking at the endings, and there's more going on. And anyways, the point is this. The emphasis in the Greek is on the kind of action, only secondarily on the time of the action when the context provides indicators of that. And so we in our thinking tend to go, well, I don't get why this was all in the past tense, and why if this was happening now in the present tense. If you're going to be talking about God's actions in time, how else would you put it? So, in other words, we might try to sit here and think, well, writing in the New Testament, does Paul have knowledge of how long the period of time is going to be where God's going to be gathering his elect people? How long the church age is, as we might describe it in that way? And so, would he be using future tenses for people up there, thinking they're going to be reading my words, and so I'm going to need to use a future tense to talk about what's going to be happening up there? Or is he simply describing the reality of what God has done? It wouldn't make any sense to use the present tense. It wouldn't make any sense to use the present tense to talk about God's decree that is forming the very fabric of time. What other tense are you going to use? In other words, if the tense that is found is the default, then you can't read a whole lot into it. If it's not the default, then you might wonder, why is it not the default? Is there something here that I need to be seeing? But the aorist here is the default. It's the simple statement. If you put it in anything else, let's say you put in the present. So God is right now doing these things. How can you put glorified into it in that sense? Now, you can talk about our present reality, but we're talking about God's decree, which has given form to all of time. So the only way to express that is God determined to do this, this, and this, and that's why it's worked out that way. And then there's going to be present tense realities. So you look at Ephesians chapter 1, predestined in time past, but now we believe because of that. We are believing now because of what happened back then. So to say, well, why this shift into the past tense? And so this is just God talking about people in the past. Why is that? Because you don't want the system that is being defended cannot have God doing something in the past that determines present action. So God knew people in the past. We need to look at their example, and we'll be encouraged by that, is all you can end up getting out of this. Whereas in reality, already the text has closed the door to this interpretation because it says, we know. We know. So Paul and his audience know that God causes all things. This is where the eternal decree of God interfaces with time. It's called providence. God causes all things to work together for the good of those who love God. And who are they? Those who are called according to his purpose. That included the believers at Rome. And so the believers at Rome are included in those whom he foreknew. To say, well, no, is to go, wait a minute, God didn't know them from of old? Does God have all knowledge of future events? This is why quoting from Molinists, open theists, and others creates a real problem as far as the sources for Dr. Flowers is concerned, because they'll all come up with different answers for that particular thing. But are you saying that God only knew people in the past? Does he know the Romans? We know that God's doing these things, and he doesn't say, just look at the past to find out. In any way, that's not there. It's being read in, but that's not in the text. And that doesn't make any sense, because in the middle of the next sentence, in talking about being conformed to the image of his Son, which is what is happening to the believers in Rome, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren, the brethren are the people that are being written to, not just people in the past. Okay? So the whole attempt to read in some kind of limitation to only past events just makes the text make no sense at all, as we will see.
He references those foreknown in the past. In fact, all the verbs from verse 29 and following are in the aorist active indicative tenses.
There's no such thing as aorist active indicative tenses. There's an aorist active tense, but not tenses. I'm not sure where the plural came from there.
Which indicates that the action of the verb has already taken place with respect to the subject of the verb.
Not always. There is such thing as a gnomic aorist. That is speaking of timeless truths. That is not. There are times when the aorist does not contain any emphasis at all upon the timing of the action, but its whole emphasis is upon how the action takes place, and it's undefined. The aorist is the simplest. The aorist says the least. You build on the aorist for your other tenses. You can see that in the formation of your prefix vowels and your endings and everything. You're building upon that. And so you're coming up from the simplest form, the earliest form, the aorist, in your study of Greek.
So when we read verse 30, it says, "And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified."
Now, I just simply have to stop and point out glorification, even in Romans 8, what are we hoping for? A future glorification. So why is this in the aorist? No one in the past has yet been glorified. So clearly, Paul is not intending the golden chain to be taken as to force the aorist into a historical narrative here is to completely miss the point. These are things God does. They are a certainty, but they are all his actions. So notice, these whom he predestined. So where does that come from? Foreknew. For those whom he foreknew, active verb. He also predestined, active verb. Now, does predestination involve choice? And does it involve action? Yes. So foreknowing must involve what? Choice and action. But the way he's using it, he's turning it into a functional passive. God knew about these guys. Well, yeah, he knew about everybody. And if you read the choice part out, then you're left going, well, God knew everybody that existed back then. He knew all the pagans. God foreknew every single person that pounded on the door of the ark before they drowned. But he did not, having foreknown them, predestined them to be conformed to the image of his Son, and therefore call them, justify them, and glorify them. So one of the most important things to learn here is when you are translating the language, the verbs will cast light upon the other verbs that are being used by the author. And if you find someone who's trying to limit the content of one verb, but not the others, there's probably a reason for it. In this case, well, let's look at a little bit more of what he says about foreknow.
Again, all in the past tense, which the most basic understanding grammatically would be in reference to those in the past.
No, I'm sorry. I dispute that. That's a simplistic statement that I do not believe you can substantiate. That would have to be derived from the context, and the context militates strongly against it, because we know we are the ones who are called according to his purpose. That calling according to purpose connects to foreknowledge, predestination, calling, the whole nine yards. No, the context says the exact opposite. This assertion disrupts and tears up the context.
Thus the word prognosko, which we translate into the word foreknew, can simply be in reference to those formerly known in times past.
Those formerly known in times past. Now think about what that means. To say formerly known in times past. So first of all, we have to be very careful that we do not attempt to look at God's knowledge as a mirror image of our own. Our knowledge is completely based upon temporality. We do not know the future. We do not have exhaustive knowledge of the present. And as I get older, the more I'm reminded we forget a lot about the past. So our knowledge is derivative and limited. And so when we say known by God in the past, that's everybody. That's everyone. So if you go with the allegedly basic meaning, which ignores utilization, is an utter violation of lexical semantics. But if you go with the basic meaning, God knew everybody in the past. But that's plainly not Paul's intention. Even if you limit it to the Jews of the past, as he's attempting to do, even though there's nothing in the text that says that, and there's no introduction of that concept, even if you limited it at that, you're still left with the reality that there's no delineation provided in the text that would allow you to say God foreknew this people versus some other people. God knew everybody. Well, yeah, but it's those who loved God. But those who loved God is in apposition to the phrase those who are called according to his purpose. So you can't. There's nowhere to hide. There's too much. There are too many lights on in Romans chapter 8 to find a dark corner to come up with these other ways of getting around what's actually being said. So for those whom he foreknew has to be an active verb. It's something God did, not something that happened to God, or God just happened to know something. This is an action on God's part that results in predestination of being conformed to the image of his Son. Now, what is that all about? How is anyone conformed to the image of Jesus Christ outside of full-on, Spirit-brought-on salvation, resurrection to spiritual life, being made a new creature? That's what it's about. It's not just look at these people in the past that God was nice to. It's talking about the context is unbreakably soteriological. It's salvific all the way through. So when we talk about being conformed to the image of his Son, how many people in the past were conformed to the image of his Son? I'm afraid with the choice meat stuff from a few months ago, we might actually be in a position where Dr. Flowers might actually say, well, anyone who's been conformed to the image of Christ in the past was so because they were choice meats. In other words, they were the people that were good enough, smart enough in and of themselves to choose to love God. Rather than we love him because he first loved us, we have to be raised to spiritual life. No one's able to submit themselves to the law of God. Law of God says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? Romans 8 says, nobody can do that if they're spiritually dead. They need to be made spiritually alive. That's the same chapter. All right, the same chapter says that. So I'm not just reading that in. That's right there and then. So be conformed to the image of his son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. So there is a purpose. This is whenever when you read Paul, you become accustomed to certain forms in Paul. Eis-ta with the infinitive. Eis-ta with the infinitive. It's all over the place. And that's what we have right here. Image of his son. Eis-ta einai. So Eis-ta, the infinitive, einai, so that he might be prototokon, firstborn, en palois adelphois, amongst many brothers. So this is clearly what is just being discussed here, is that it has always been God's intention to redeem a particular people in Christ Jesus. That's quite true. The point for the Romans is, and that's what he's doing amongst you. You are the called. You're being conformed to the image of Christ. You have this firm foundation. That's why no charge will be brought against God's elect, and therefore nothing can separate us from the love of God. Consistency all the way through, straight through. Just like John 6, just like Ephesians 1, just like Romans 9, one side can just walk word, verse, straight through it. Don't have to jump off into the woods over here. Don't have to jump off into the woods over there. The other side cannot do it. It's just not. They can't do it. We keep waiting, and we don't get it. We don't get it. So, just a few of the things right in the context that immediately start telling us we've got Houston, there is a problem. Well, Houston had a big problem last night. Nobody will understand that 5 years from now. I can't even remember who won last year. So it's just sort of, it's sad. Anyway.
In the Calvinism versus Arminianism debate since the 16th century that's dominated Western Christianity, many have failed to look outside of the parameters set in the 16th century to understand various ways to interpret this passage.
I'm not going to completely disagree with that, but I would simply point out that not all the reformers were ignorant of first century Christianity, or second, or third. In fact, I would say most of the people back there were more familiar with the historical context of theological discussion than the vast majority of people are today.
To be more consistent with the first century language. Many modern scholars, therefore, only see two options with regard to this text. Prognosko either means foresee, or it must mean to foreordain. Prominent Calvinistic pastor John Piper, for example, says, option one is God foresaw our self-determined faith. We remain the decisive cause of our salvation, and God responds to our decision to believe.
Which I believe he actually lays out as a possible understanding, just not his own view, that's still better than the golden chain, even though he then accuses us of strawmanning these views by saying God looks down the corridors of time. I did not understand how anything he said demonstrated a straw man with that perspective, because that is what you're saying. It's not your position, but it's the position of a large number of people that we've reviewed in this program over and over and over and over again. It's exactly how they saw it. So there wasn't any straw man there. What is a straw man? I told somebody on Twitter, I pointed this. Did you notice how many times he used the term fated? He knows that fate is impersonal. We've pointed this out over and over again. Fate is impersonal. God doesn't do anything by fate. Fate is not rolling. Fate is rolling a dice, and God's not in charge of it or something. Which even then God is. But that's a specific choice on his part.
Option two, according to John Piper, is God chose us not on the basis of foreseen faith, but on the basis of nothing in us. He called us, and the call itself creates the faith for which it calls. We believe that John Piper, like many modern-day theologians, have simply set up a false dichotomy. by presenting only two possible options to this text, when more options are actually available. In fact, the most simple, basic understanding of the word prognosko is formally known, or known before.
Again, this kind of argument ignores the fact that the verb is being used by an author in a context and in a series of verbs. And to take it in this way, where there is no active element of choice on the part of the one doing the action of the verb, whereas every other verb does, is the fundamental error of this particular presentation.
Romans 11:2 is the only other time the word prognosko is used in the letter to the Romans. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. This clearly is in reference to the Israelites of the past, who God knew formally.
Who God knew formally. How about who God chose formally? How about who God chose formally? Let's put this one to bed, because this really does need to be something that is addressed. And this may be dismissed, but Kittle's Theological Dictionary in the New Testament, in specifically defining prognosko, says, in the New Testament, prognoskine, that's the infinitival form, is referred to God. His foreknowledge, however, is an election or foreordination of his people or Christ. Volume 1, page 715. Now, where does that come from? Well, if you simply go back into the Old Testament and look at what came to us from the Old Testament, you will understand. And I want to go through this mainly because Rich spent so much time today trying to get the Hebrew term yada to format correctly on the internet, that if I didn't, I think he'd cry. And even though he's wearing a really boring red sweater, I still am going to do this for him. So, I need to refresh it, and Yada will. Okay, let's see if this is going to work. There you go. See.
And, folks, just so you know, if you go to aomin.org and you go to the very bottom where the search engine is, but won't be for long, hopefully.
Yes.
It'll be a more prominent place.
Yes.
And put the word foreknowledge in.
Mm-hmm.
This article is going to pop up from 30 years ago this month.
30
when
years.
the internet did not exist.
Yes. I've been talking about this for a long time. So this is an article from 1989. 30 years ago. The basic Hebrew term translated to know in the Old Testament is yada. Both Greek terms noted above, gnoska and oida, are used to translate this one Hebrew word. Gnosko is used over 500 times as the translation of yada in the Septuagint. And what does this term mean in Hebrew? Does it refer simply to having intellectual knowledge? No, indeed. When the Hebrew speaks of God's knowledge, something far more than just bare cognizance of facts is in view. Let's look at some passages where this will be seen and see if some of the fuller meaning of yada can be discovered. Yada is the Hebrew term to know. Before I formed in the womb, I knew, yada you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I've appointed you a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah 1:5. Here God says that he knew Jeremiah even before he formed the prophet in the womb. Does this mean that God simply had knowledge of the future actions? Future actions of Jeremiah? Clearly not. For the parallelism of the passage indicates is capitalized there. And he's on it immediately. That the knowing is to be understood as being synonymous with God's consecration of him and his appointing him as a prophet to the nations. Hence, the term refers to an action on God's part in choosing Jeremiah. God is active in his knowing, in his choosing. The object of his knowing is not a fact, but a person. God's yada of Jeremiah is personal. Is this kind of understanding a common feature of Hebrew thinking? Indeed it is. For the Jewish person, knowledge is very personal. One cannot know something truly in, capitalized, the Hebrew system of thought simply by standing afar off and thinking about an object. By the way, I'm saying that so he can find the... I'm doing online editing while reading it, and it's because this was scanned in. It was 1989. It was 30 years ago. We had to scan this in. When Adam knew Eve in Genesis 4:1, the result was the conception of a child. Obviously, then, this knowing of Eve by Adam was far more than a simple understanding of her existence. His yada of his wife was intensely personal. And when we speak of God's knowing someone, we are speaking of his entering into personal relationship with that individual. This is seen very clearly, and so let me stop. That would mean, if the simple meaning were to be used, that if God knew these people in the past, that he entered into relationship with them. The beauty of foreknown is that what's actually being said is that God chooses to enter into relationship before we come into existence, just as he did with Jeremiah. That's the beauty of it, which is lost when you run it through the synergism filters that has to remove all the beautiful stuff about God. This is seen very clearly in Yahweh's encounter with Moses in Exodus 33. In verse 17, we hear God saying to Moses, I will do this thing for you for which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known, yada, you by name. Earlier, Moses indicated that God has spoken these words to him before. Surely we here see that God is not simply saying, I know your name, but that something far more personal is in view here. The knowing of Moses' name is very personal. God is indicating his gracious decision to enter into a very special and personal relationship with Moses. The fact this passage figures so prominently in Paul's discussion of election in Romans 9:15 is surely significant as well, for if Paul connects verse 19 of this chapter with God's predestination in Romans 9, surely his usage of foreknow in Romans 8 is drawn from here as well. And then, this is a good one, the continued emphasis upon the personal nature of the object of God's knowledge is seen as well in Amos 3:2, where the nation of Israel as God's special covenant people is addressed. You only have I known, yada, among all the nations of the earth. Here God asserts that he has known only the people of Israel. Again, bare factual knowledge cannot possibly be the meaning, as God surely knows that the other people exist, for he created them. Instead, the word know means to choose. Both the New American Standard Bible and the New International Version render yada here as chosen. So prevalent is this sense of the Hebrew term when in reference to God that the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament comments, we find yada in Amos 3:2 as an expression for the special relationship between Yahweh and Israel, or election to service. In Exodus 33:12-17, yada characterizes a special election and call. In Jeremiah 1:5, the appointment of Jeremiah to prophetic office is characterized by yada. Long before his birth, Jeremiah had been chosen as a prophet. So that emphasis in yada is what comes into the New Testament and is now being read out of one of its most beautiful uses in Romans chapter 8, which becomes the very basis for the hymn of praise. Nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. That foundation is found in the fact that he foreknew us, predestined us, called us, justified us, glorified us. It's all God's actions, which is why nothing can separate us. You take that away, and lots of things can separate us. And in many people's theologies, our own actions will separate us. We're the ones that do it. All right, I got to keep going here.
One other time the Apostle Paul uses this term is in Acts 26, verse 4 and 5, when he speaks about his manner from youth and says they have known for a long time, which is, again, the word prognosko, simply interpreted as knowing something in the past. So the term prognosko...
But again, no parallel. No parallel. Because, why? Because this is man's knowledge. Man has limited knowledge. This isn't God foreknowing someone. Whenever God foreknows someone, it's personal knowledge. He has foreknowledge of future events. That's a noun, because he created all things. He foreknows individuals, specifically Israel, the elect, and Jesus. Now, when Jesus is described as foreknown, is that just, oh yeah, God knew Jesus? That didn't come up, but it is used. Paul didn't use it. And it is really hard to try to fit that one into this scheme that's being presented. Yeah, well, God knew Jesus in the past. Really? You think? That Trinity thing sort of already said that in essence. So we could go on that for a while, but we won't.
Or foreknew, simply means to formally know or to know before. It does not need a lot of philosophical, esoteric baggage attached to it.
Yeah, except that the authors actually use it in particular contexts that provide that baggage that is beautiful and important and happens to be completely contradictory to the synergistic traditionalist system that someone is attempting to defend.
It's a very simple word. And just as Paul uses it in Acts and in Romans 11:2, it simply can be in reference to the Israelites of the past who loved God and were called according to his purpose.
So that's what you want to limit it to. It has nothing to do with Romans, which makes this passage completely incoherent. Completely incoherent. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. For those whom he used to know in the past, Israelites, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his son, so he'd be the first one among brethren back then. That had nothing to do with you. Why does he go into all this stuff about all their salvation and stuff like that when it... I mean, it sounds like he was a Calvinist back then, but now he's doing the free will thing? I don't know. And those whom he predestined, he also called. Those who he called, he also justified. Those who he justified, he also glorified. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who is against us? Wait a minute. Well, wait a minute. Time out. Us? Paul, you're just talking about the people in the past. Well, but we're supposed to look back and be encouraged by them. Then why do you then say, what then shall we say these things if God is for us? Because everything he just said was about us, the people to whom he's writing right now. It's just, it's so obvious that it's sort of hard. Put yourself in my position. Sometimes it's really hard to try to deal with eisegetical attempts to get around what is so plainly right there. If God is for us, who is against us? He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all. Do we have to go through this again? We've done it like 3 or 4 times over the past number of months. It's stunningly clear. We did it in light of David Allen's attempts to get around it on the last program and demonstrated those attempts failed. This attempt fails too.